So the Wisconsin Supreme Court was urged by the Biden campaign not to address any substantive issues. And that's exactly what happened.
It's been alleged that 60 courts have refused to hear these cases. Therefore, there was no fraud in the election. I guess another way of looking at this is that the court cases have been refused for procedural and technical reasons.
The opposition doesn't argue we're wrong. It argues we shouldn't be heard. The Biden campaign argued to the court that we're not going to talk about any of the substantive things. We're not even going to dispute the things I just brought up to you. But instead, you just shouldn't hear them.
And for some reason, the other side was very focused on, we've got to fix the potential for problem from 2016, but in 2020, when there's potential for problem and things that have been shown, everyone seems to say, move along.
There's no dispute that the election would have turned out differently in Wisconsin if, according to our allegations and according to our proofs, the court accepted those, that the election result would be different. But instead of addressing the substantive claims, the Biden campaign argues, don't talk about them. What do you have to hide?
And I think we know in this case what there is to hide.
After 4 years of that, being told that the last election was fake and that Donald Trump wasn't really elected and that Russia intervened, after 4 years of that, now these same people are told, you just sit down and shut up. If you have any concerns about election integrity, you're a nutcase. You should shut up. Well, I tell you what, 74 million Americans are not going to shut up.
But we can't just say it didn't happen. We can't just say, 4,000 people voted in Nevada that were non-citizens, and we're just going to ignore it. We're going to sweep it under the rug and say, the courts have decided the facts. The courts have not decided the facts. The courts never looked at the facts. The courts don't like elections, and so they stayed out of it by finding an excuse, standing or otherwise, to stay out of it. But the fraud happened. The election in many ways was stolen.
It had nothing to do with this report.
You lied repeatedly.
I did not.
You lied repeatedly in the press that I was spreading Russian disinformation, and that was an outright lie, and I told you to stop lying, and you continue to do it. Equipment and data. I believe the alleged irregularities can be organized into three basic categories. Number one, lax enforcement or violations of election laws and controls. 2, allegations of fraudulent votes and ballot stuffing. And 3, corruption of voting machines and software that might be programmed to add or switch votes. In order to effectively determine the extent to which voting machines were subject to nefarious intrusion or other vulnerabilities, computer science experts must be given the opportunity to examine these allegations. Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The President and many of his supporters are, unfortunately, continuing their efforts to undermine the will of the people, disenfranchise voters, and sow the seeds of mistrust and discontent to further their partisan desire for power. Whether intended or not, this hearing gives a platform to conspiracy theories and lies, and it's a destructive exercise that has no place in the United States Senate.
The March 27, 2019 press release and letter, which let me just read a segment from that letter again. The integrity, this is Senator Peters joining and writing this letter. The integrity of our elections remain under serious threat. Our nation's intelligence agencies continue to raise the alarm that foreign adversaries are actively trying to undermine our system of democracy and will target the 2020 elections as they did in 2016 and the 2018 elections. A combination of older legacy machines and newer systems, vulnerabilities in each present a problem with the security of our democracy, and they must be addressed until, I guess right now, let's move on. Let's not worry about this, because if we look at this, it's dangerous to our democracy. Okay. It is the tradition of this committee to swear in witnesses, so those via WebEx, if you raise your right hand, you here in person, please rise. Raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you will give before this committee will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
By a reminder that in history, there was, in fact, a campaign, an illicit campaign, to deprive Abraham Lincoln of the presidency, and that was through the use of mail-in ballots.
Absentee voting in Wisconsin is treated quite differently, I believe, than other parts of the country. Let me read for you what the legislature found. It's in our statutes. It says that the legislature finds that the privilege of voting by absentee ballot must be carefully regulated to prevent the potential for fraud or abuse, to prevent overzealous solicitation of absent electors who may prefer not to participate in an election, to prevent undue influence on an absent elector to vote for or against a candidate. As a consequence, our laws are strictly construed, and even more so, let me read again from the law, results which do not comply with those regulations, quote, may not be included in the certified result of any election. So it's very straightforward that the state of Wisconsin has taken a very different view of in-person voting with all the protections and absentee voting that has been repeatedly, including in the Carter Commission report, thought to be a source of significant potential for fraud. In Wisconsin, we just completed a recount. We had more than 2,500 volunteers, or probably more than 1,000 volunteers for the Biden campaign as well. Uniquely, we are able to examine actual envelopes that contain the ballots that are submitted by absentee voters. This allowed us to identify by person, by address, by ward. It's not conspiracy. The real names are in the record. And here's what we found. We found that there were incomplete and altered certificates. These are the certificates on the front of the envelopes that have to be exactly done correctly under our law. If not, those results may not be counted. How many of those? More than 3,000 of those identified by person were nonetheless counted, even though they are clearly invalid under the law. A second category. Initials of clerks are placed on all of those envelopes. Why? Because the clerk identifies it having been properly received and identification is provided. That's the check in advance of the election. What did we find? More than 2,000 of those ballots in Dane and Milwaukee County had no initials at all, but nonetheless, they got counted. We also have special laws in Wisconsin with regard to voting in advance. We do not allow advance voting. We allow in-person and other voting as absentees. So anything before Election Day is under our absentee rules. What did the city of Madison do? They created a system where people could arrive at a park, hand in their ballots in envelopes 5 weeks before the election. They also created boxes. No controls at all, just boxes on corners that you could throw the ballot in. No attempt at all. And our statutes explicitly say there are only 2 ways to submit an absentee ballot: in person or delivery to the clerk's office. That's it. Nothing else is allowed. And yet the city of Madison, we had 17,271 ballots in this category that we identify. There are tens of thousands more because they commingled the ballots afterwards, so we couldn't identify each one that may have been improperly cast. Then we have an interesting category called indefinitely confined. These are people which the statute, I read from the statute, by age, physical illness, or infirmity, or are disabled indefinitely. Among those claiming this status, so they don't have to provide any identification, among those claiming this status is one of the electors for Joe Biden. Who said, I can't get to the polls. We have poll workers who claimed it. We have people who went to protests, people who had weddings, people who had vacations. All claimed this status, I can't get to the polls, so they were able to vote without identification. There were 28,395 people we explicitly identified. Finally, there are other categories in which as much as 170,000 other ballots were submitted without any application. In fact, they considered the certification envelope the application, though a separate application is required by law. 3 million people properly voted in the state of Wisconsin. More than 200,000 identified during this recount did not. But those votes got counted, and our statute says they should not have been. That, in our view, is a taint on our election in Wisconsin. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Troupas. And I believe Joe Biden won our state by about 20,000 votes.
Correct.
And you're talking about over 200,000 that were outside of our law that probably, if the law would have been followed, probably shouldn't have been counted.
Correct.
Shouldn't have been accepted, shouldn't have been put in the ballot pool.
Over 42,000 people voted more than once. Our experts were able to make this determination by reviewing the list of actual voters and comparing it to other voters with the same name, address, and date of birth. This method was also able to catch people using different variations of their first name, such as William and Bill, and individuals who were registered both under a married name and a maiden name. At least 1,500 dead people are recorded as voting, as shown by comparing the list of male voters with the Social Security death records. More than 19,000 people voted even though they didn't live in Nevada. This does not include military voters or students. These voters were identified by comparing the list of voters with the U.S. Postal Service's National Change of Address database, among other sources. About 8,000 people voted from non-existent addresses. Here we cross-reference voters with the Coding Accuracy Support System, which allowed our experts to identify undeliverable addresses. Over 15,000 votes were cast from commercial or vacant addresses. Our experts found these voters by analyzing official U.S. Postal Service records that flag non-residential addresses and addresses vacant for more than 90 days. Incredibly, almost 4,000 non-citizens also voted, as determined by comparing official DMV records of non-citizens to the list of actual voters in the 2020 election. The list goes on. All in all, our experts identified 130,000 unique instances of voter fraud in Nevada. But the actual number is almost certainly higher. Our data scientists made these calculations not by estimations or statistical sampling, but by analyzing and comparing the list of actual voters with other lists, most of which are publicly available. To put it simply, they explained their methods so others could check their work. Our evidence has never been refuted, only ignored. 2 Clark County technical employees came forward completely independent of each other and explained that they discovered that the number of votes recorded by voting machines and stored on USB drives would change between the time the polls were closed at night and when they were reopened the next morning. In other words, votes were literally appearing and disappearing in the dead of night. When we attempted to verify the integrity of these voting machines, we were allowed only a useless visual inspection of the outside of a USB drive. We were denied a forensic examination. Finally, our investigation also uncovered a campaign to illegally incentivize votes from marginalized populations by requiring people to prove that they voted to receive raffle tickets for gift cards, televisions, and more. Our determined team verified these irregularities without any of the tools of law enforcement, such as grand jury, subpoenas, or FBI agents. Instead, we had less than a month to use critical thinking and elbow grease to compile our evidence. We tried to obtain testimony or documents from Clark County officials, but they obstructed and stonewalled. When we filed suit, state officials and even courts delayed proceedings for days.
So the Wisconsin Supreme Court was urged by the Biden campaign not to address any substantive issues. And that's exactly what happened. The Biden campaign argued to the court that we're not going to talk about any of the substantive things. We're not even going to dispute the things I just brought up to you. But instead, you just shouldn't hear them because a state agency, the Wisconsin Election Commission, had authorized some of these activities. And candidly, as Chief Justice Roggensack and other dissenters held, one, the claims are substantive, they are substantial, and they needed to be addressed. Second, the Wisconsin Election Commission is a bureaucratic organization, explicitly that the same court just 4 months ago said has no meaning. it is not law. It is some advice given, and that the statute should control. We were disappointed, not so much in the decision, but in the fact that the decision itself is premised not on an analysis of the law, nor the analysis of the claims. It's an idea that we should not have a transparent system, that you're not going to address these things. And that's what they argued. So it's disappointing, especially in Wisconsin. And Senator Johnson, as you know, we have a long history in Wisconsin, unlike other states, I know unlike other states, of high transparency. Our recounts were conducted with utmost integrity by both Milwaukee and Dane County, with thousands of volunteers able to look at those items. And it's really a sad day, frankly, when the opposition doesn't argue we're wrong. It argues we shouldn't be heard. That's a strange thing in a state that is so transparent as ours.
Mr. Troop is talking about the law that he was arguing before the Wisconsin Supreme Court was basically ignored. You had a similar statement that it wasn't that the information that you just presented to the committee, it was never rebutted, it was simply ignored. Can you talk about that?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. It was extremely disappointing that rather than address our issues and the data that we presented head on, they simply tried to use technicalities and limiting our evidence, limiting the amount of witnesses we could bring forward, saying that we couldn't introduce any live testimony, but only 15 depositions, only use 15 depositions to show 130,000 instances of voter fraud. And then when it went to the Supreme Court of Nevada, they gave us 2 hours to brief the issues before immediately coming down with a decision. A record was over 8,000 pages long. We were never fully considered by those courts. They never took a good hard list at hard evidence.
So I think it's important to step back and actually look at how votes are cast in the country, particularly with paper ballots, and that regardless of any internet connections, regardless of any foreign hacking, as long as you've got the paper receipt.
Okay, but let me stop you there. I acknowledge that, yes, the paper backup is the control if it's used.
Throughout, you're going to, particularly where a vote is cast on election day, those machines tend to and should not be connected to the internet, certainly as a best practice.
But some have the capability, don't they?
Some may have modems that are typically disabled, but in certain states, I believe in Wisconsin, some are temporarily activated to transmit some counts. But again, when you have paper and you can conduct a post-election audit,
if they're
it's
conducted,
an important security control.
But those tabulators are connected on election day because that's how they transmit the data to the counties and also into the unofficial.
In some cases, yes, sir.
Yeah.
That's right.
Okay. Yeah. Okay.
The Election Infrastructure Government Coordinating Council, Executive Committee, and the Election Infrastructure Sector Coordinating Council, comprising of federal, state, and local government officials and numerous private sector organizations from all around the country, jointly called this, quote, the most secure in American history, end of quote. Have you seen anything in the week since November 4th that would lead you to change your mind? And have you identified any credible claim of widespread election irregularities?
I stand by the claim. I said it in my opening statement. It's in my written testimony. I'm yet to see anything from a security perspective, that would change my opinion on that. Fraud is a different matter. It's a criminal matter.
CISA's rumor control page was actually created within your agency. You mentioned it in your testimony to address foreign disinformation having an impact on the election. Yet rather than creating fake news, it seems as if Russia has simply used state-controlled news outlets to basically push President Trump's own statements and lies about a rigged election. My question is, how are our foreign adversaries taking advantage of false claims of broad election fraud by the president and his supporters, or hearings, like we're hearing here, we're hearing these statements again, that are broadly claiming systemic irregularities where none exist? How damaging is that?
So talking about rumor control very briefly, I think that was an innovation in government that we created on the fly to address some emerging threats. But again, Chairman Johnson, I'm going to keep coming back to it. That's why it's so important to have a paper trail. That's why it's so important to have paper ballots. So even if there was foreign interference, of a, malicious algorithm nature, you can always go back to the receipts.
I just have to talk about Russian disinformation because the people peddling it are not on my side of the aisle. Senior Democrat leaders, including Ranking Member Peters, were involved in a process of creating a false intelligence product that was supposedly classified. They leaked to the media that accused Senator Grassley, the President Pro Tem of the Senate, and myself of accepting and disseminating Russian disinformation from Andrei Derkach. I'd never heard of the person until they brought it up. Senator Peters introduced that false information, Russian disinformation, into our investigation record. 50 people associated with the intelligence community after our Hunter Biden investigation and the revelations of the Hunter Biden computer said, oh, this is Russian disinformation. Now we find out, no, it's a real investigation by the Justice Department. So it's just galling, and I just have to point out that the purveyors of Russian disinformation, Hillary Clinton's campaign, the DNC, the Steele dossier, the Ranking Member Peters accusing Senator Grassley and I of disseminating Russian disinformation, that's where the disinformation is coming. That's where the false information, the lies, the false allegations. I can't sit by here and listen to this and say that this is not disinformation, this hearing today. This is getting information we have to take a look at to restore confidence in our election integrity. We're not going to be able to just move on without bringing up these irregularities, examining them, and providing an explanation, and see where there really are problems so we can correct it moving forward. Senator Paul.
Mr. Chairman, I got to respond to that. I mean, you're saying I'm putting out information. Well, one, it had nothing to do with this report.
You lied repeatedly.
I did not
you lied
this.
repeatedly in the press that I was spreading Russian disinformation, and that was an outright lie, and I told you to stop lying, and you continue to do it.
Mr. Chairman, this is not about airing your grievances. I don't know what rabbit hole you're running down.
You
right
talked
now.
about Russian
going down rabbit
disinformation.
holes.
Senator Paul.
This is simply not what we're dealing
Senator Paul.
with. But, Mr. Chairman, you can't make these
Judge
false
Starr.
allegations and then dropping it there. That is why this
Senator
committee
Paul.
needs to return back
Judge
to its
Starr,
Senator Paul.
partisan things. This is terrible what you're doing to this committee and all the great work that you talked about.
It is what you have done to this committee.
It is not
falsely
the case.
accusing the chairman of spreading disinformation. Nothing could have been further from the truth, and you're spouting it again, which is why I had to respond.
Come
Senator
on.
Paul.
Mr. Chairman.
Judge Starr.
This is outrageous. This is outrageous.
Judge Starr, it's been alleged that 60 courts have refused to hear these cases. Therefore, there was no fraud in the election. I guess another way of looking at this is that the court cases have been refused for procedural and technical reasons. When you see the 60 court cases rejected, do you think that's a conclusion by our court system that there is no fraud, or do you think that the court cases were primarily rejected for procedural reasons?
Right, Senator Paul, it is my understanding that the vast majority of these cases were rejected for rightly stated procedural reasons, as opposed to merits-based or substantive-based evaluations. And of course, we saw that very recently, and I think most dramatically, by the Supreme Court's unanimous rejection of the bill of complaint filed by the Texas Attorney General, my home state here. And the entirety of the decision was based upon the legal concept of standing. You just don't, Texas, have standing to object to what happened in Wisconsin or Pennsylvania or whatever.
There is another important aspect to this, though, that is a legal aspect that I think does need to be heard by the courts, and I don't know if it can be heard beyond the election, but I think should. And this is the question of whether or not people who are non-legislators can change the election law. And this happened in many, many states. Probably 24 states decided to accept ballots after the election. 24 states decided they could mail out applications or mail out ballots, all without the will of the legislature. Do you think there's any hope for any of this being heard, Judge Starr, outside of the concept of changing the election? Is there any possibility any court's going to ever hear this and say that it was wrong that secretaries of state changed the law in the middle of this pandemic without the approval of the legislature, or do you think there's no hope because it's mixed up in electoral politics? Judge Starr.
I think there is a possibility because this issue may return in light of the use, this unprecedented use of mail-in ballots. This issue may recur again. The Constitution is very clear that it is the prerogative of state legislatures to determine what these rules and laws are. And that was, I must say, flagrantly violated in Pennsylvania and perhaps elsewhere as well.
Yeah, see, I think the legal question there is a very easy one to decide. I think even as a physician, I can figure out that the Secretary of State cannot create law. But we can't just say it didn't happen. We can't just say, oh, 4,000 people voted in Nevada that were non-citizens, and we're just going to ignore it. We're going to sweep it under the rug and say, oh, the courts have decided the facts. The courts have not decided the facts. The courts never looked at the facts. The courts don't like elections, and so they stayed out of it by finding an excuse, standing or otherwise, to stay out of it. But the fraud happened. The election in many ways was stolen. And the only last comment I would say on what Mr. Krebs, and he can speak for himself, but I think his job was keeping the foreigners out of the election. It was the most secure election based on security of the internet and technology. But he never has voiced an opinion, he's welcome to today, on whether or not dead people voted. I don't think he examined that. Did he examine non-citizens voting? So to say it was the safest election, sure, I agree with your statement if you're referring to foreign intervention. But if you're saying it's the safest election based on no dead people voted, no non-citizens voted, no people broke the absentee rules, I think that's false. And I think that's what's upset a lot of people on our side, is that they're taking your statement to mean, oh, well, there was no problem in the elections. I don't think you examined any of the problems that we've heard here. So really, you're just referring to something different.
December 2016, there was a poll that was done on if the American people believed that the Russians interfered and changed our election. At that time, 32% of the people believed that the Russians had influenced the outcome of the election in December of 2016. Based on that belief and what was going on, there was launched a whole series of hearings. Certainly the Russians were trying to interfere in our elections, but we spent millions and millions of dollars investigating it, going through it, ramping up entities like CISA and others to be able to go engage, to be able to make sure we can protect our next election. Senator Klobuchar and I worked for years on election security legislation and worked to be able to get that implemented. We did 6 different public hearings on Russian interference just on that one topic to make sure that we were paying attention to it, when it all started with 32% of Americans in December of 2016 believing the Russians had interfered in our election. A few days ago, another poll asked the question, do you believe there was election and voter fraud in the presidential election between Joe Biden and Donald Trump? This December, 46% of the voters in America have said yes, 45% saying no. Interestingly enough, Trump voters say there was fraud, 80%. Biden voters also said 16% that they believe that there was voter fraud. The reason I bring that up is we watched what happened in 2016 and what the American people thought and saw, and so we engaged with hearings, we looked at the issues and determined, do things need to change? Much of the work that's gone on the last several years to be able to get paper ballots into states happened because this Congress engaged on an issue where we saw an obvious problem. And so we distributed federal dollars, assistance, and a constant drumbeat to say these states have got to fix the areas where they don't have paper ballots and we have the potential for problems. That was the question. Is there a potential for a problem? The answer was yes, there's a potential, and we ought to fix that. Now, amazingly, after this election, all kinds of issues have come up and said there are potentials for problem, and everyone seems to be saying, move on. The only reason I can think that that would be different was because the election outcome seemed to be different. And one side is now saying, let's just move on and ignore this. In my state on election night, like 27 other states in the country, by that evening, we were counting votes and all absentee ballots had been received. There was much less opportunity for accusations of fraud because all of our ballots were in. Amazingly enough, a week after the election was completed, this November, Oklahomans were listening to other states that were saying things like, we don't know how many more ballots there are left to count. We had been done for a week. We and 27 other states had been completed for a week. That gives opportunities for fraud and questions and problems. That's a reasonable question to ask. It's reasonable to be able to ask if people can drift around and gather ballots from other people and do ballot harvesting, and in some states that's legal, does that provide an opportunity for fraud? I think the obvious answer is yes. The obvious answer is if you mail a ballot to everyone in the state, even if they didn't ask for it, does it provide an opportunity for fraud, especially when the state did not first purge or verify those addresses, and they sent thousands of ballots to people that no longer live there. I've talked to Nevada residents that receive multiple ballots at their home for people that no longer live there. That's a problem. And we should at least admit that's a problem. And for some reason, the other side was very focused on, we've got to fix the potential for problem from 2016, but in 2020, when there's potential for problem and things that have been shown, everyone seems to say, move along. Let's not discuss this. There's a system called the ERIC system that's in place that 30 states cooperate with. It helps them verify if people have moved and they're registered in 2 different states, or if they've moved into your state and they're registered somewhere else. It helps them determine if they're voting in 2 different states. Only 30 states use that. Other states are not. And even of the 30 states that use it, not all of them are actually using it. They literally are on the system, but they're not actually purging their rolls when they know there are people that have moved out of their states and have been informed of that. Just this last year in the ERIC system, they identified 91,000 people that are registered voters that are dead. 91,000 that one system had recognized. There are problems in the system. And in this conversation that I've had with so many people, and I've said, is it a problem that people are voting in 2 states? Is it a problem that people are voting after they're dead? And this is what I hear over and over again. This has been going on for years. So why don't we fix it? Should be the next statement. Instead, the statement seems to be, well, let's just move along. Mr. Binnall, 42,000 people in Nevada voted more than once, according to your work in this. 42,000 people. 1,500 people voted in Nevada that were dead. 19,000 people voted though they did not live in Nevada, and they weren't a college student. 8,000 people voted from a non-existent address. 15,000 people voted though they were registered to a commercial address or a vacant address, and 4,000 people voted in Nevada that are non-citizens. My question to you is, in my state, when someone votes twice, and we do have that occasionally, and about 50 times a year that actually occurs in our state, we prosecute individuals that vote twice. Of this 130,000 instances that you have identified from the 2020 election in Nevada, do you know of any prosecutions currently going on in Nevada for any voter fraud?
Not yet, Senator, and that's extremely important. These laws have to be enforced.
I value the paper backups, I value the controls, but they're only as good as they're actually used.
The very sad fact is that we were denied access to almost anything meaningful that would allow us to verify.
Can you be specific?
Absolutely, Senator. Let's talk about the paper backups on the electronic machines. We were denied any access to those except from one machine in the entire state of Nevada. We were denied that access. I wish I could have quoted Mr. Krebs when we were fighting our discovery fights at in Nevada, saying how important it was to get access to these. We couldn't see any paper backups, and on top of that, the printers on the machine were malfunctioning at such a high rate. We doubt that the paper backups were actually giving us anything of use anyhow. So these paper backups that are supposed to provide such transparency, we couldn't use them. We couldn't see them. We couldn't use they provided us zero transparency at all, except in one machine in the entire state of Nevada. Another example is the fact that we were denied any meaningful discovery in the case in order to go and examine the full extent of the voter fraud. For instance, even when we were able to subpoena the records that led us to discover those 4,000 non-citizens who voted, we couldn't put that into evidence because we didn't get them until the end of the discovery period, and then the court said, well, at that point it's too late. Our discovery period was essentially 3 days. And we were denied any meaningful opportunity to even use in our case the information that we got. And the court didn't even consider those things, unfortunately. We were denied, we tried to be able to understand the code of these machines, to be able to find out, for instance, as the chairman pointed out, whether machines were hooked up to the internet, whether any of that happened, be able to do a forensic review. We brought forensic experts all the way to Nevada, people that could have discovered this information, people that could have told us what happened with these machines, and we weren't allowed near them. We weren't allowed any forensic audit of it. Nothing that could have given us any transparency, because transparency is not political. That's what we've talked about here. That's what we were denied in Nevada, is any attempt to actually find out what happened. We had a clerk who, a registrar of voters, who literally dodged our subpoenas. We had the holiday weekend over Thanksgiving in order to serve subpoenas. They locked the doors of the offices. He locked himself in his house. He refused to accept a subpoena. That same registrar of voters, we have a whistleblower that says he was wearing a Biden-Harris pen to inspect voter sites. This isn't something where we're trying to attack officials. We're trying to say that we have to make sure that it's nonpartisan, that we have to make sure that there's transparency. And you can't deny transparency at every turn, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Krebs, real quick, mindful that, again, all this testimony is under oath. So what you heard from Mr. Bernal is testimony under oath. Does that trouble you? And in your assessment, this is the most secure election. Again, I'm all for paper backups. I'm all for those controls. I think, if used, it works.
If you've got, we're talking about paper backups, but we're also talking about paper ballots.
But again, only if they have, he's just said they didn't have access to the ballots. Again.
I'm not,
again, all I'm asking, does that trouble you that there wasn't that kind of a transparency, or are you challenging his testimony?
Oh, of course not.
Okay, so again, this system is, we only have confidence in it if it's completely transparent, and somebody who's challenging results has access to the information. The paper ballot backup can have their forensic experts take a look at the computer systems, and that wasn't afforded. I'm just asking, does that concern you?
I think that there are multiple controls in place throughout the system. If there is a legal mechanism at the back end that allows for independent third-party auditing.
But that's the problem. The legal system didn't allow for the transparency. Okay, you can talk about all these controls up front, but then in the end, where there are affidavits signed and people are making charges, when you can't obtain the evidence to actually try it in court, and your evidence is denied in court, do you understand how that frustrates people? And that's the problem. That's why there's suspicions, because this was not, in so many cases that we've heard about, a transparent process. But with that, I'll turn to Senator Scott.
2 years ago, I got elected. I won election night by 54,000 votes. And Chuck Schumer sent a lawyer down and basically said, I don't care what the votes are, we're going to win through the courts. And we went through unbelievable number of lawsuits. We had, I think, something like 1,000 lawyers working with us. We went through 2 recounts. And he didn't care what the votes are. Chuck Schumer's goal was to win, and his lawyer was just to win through the courts. It didn't matter what the votes are. It didn't let me come to orientation. And so when I watch this stuff now, I did not remember one Democrat in this entire country say, that's not right. You shouldn't be doing it that way. They were all in on this.
Senator, one of the fascinating things about Wisconsin is, as I said, we have a long history of real transparency in our process, in our recount process, in all of our processes. So it's particularly odd here. And several of the justices on our court this last week called what the Democrats had done in the majority of the court, in the Supreme Court, as absurd and bizarre. And the reason they referred to it that way is they said, the issue here is what confidence do people have in the election process? So if that's what we hear, and I've heard that, I've been hearing that all day here, confidence in the election process, well then why, when everything is teed up, I mean, you know, I'm a former judge, my co-counsel is a former president of the state bar. We had teed up everything. We absolutely, you knew the names, addresses, wards, you had exact records. And what the Biden campaign did not want the court to do is to actually address the substantive question. That's the holding of the court. We won't address the substantive question. And the Chief Justice, I mean, it's a great frustration in the Chief Justice when she said, 4 members of this court throw the cloak of laches over numerous problems that will be repeated again and again until this court has the courage to correct them. Candidly, it was all Democrat talking points. I mean, they did make the same thing. I heard something about Justice Karofsky's comment. It was just a talking point. And I guess the frustration you hear from those of us who are serious lawyers, who have taken this seriously, is that when we pose these matters to courts, we expect them to address them. When they don't, it undermines the integrity of our system. That's what's going on here. The frustration that you hear, even in good Democrat circles, is if the courts don't address these, who's going to? Aren't they the ultimate arbiters? There's no dispute that the election would have turned out differently in Wisconsin if, according to our allegations and according to our proofs, the court accepted those, that the election result would be different. But instead of addressing the substantive claims, the Biden campaign argues, don't talk about them. Don't address them. And that's why I thanked Senator Johnson when he first called and asked if I would talk, because if you don't inquire here in the Senate, and as Ken Starr said a minute ago, if you don't do this inquiry, there really isn't going to be any analysis, and there isn't going to be an opportunity to get the very integrity that we all want. I mean, as I said, as a former judge, you know, this is a serious matter to me, and no one suggested at any point in the process that the allegations in Wisconsin are anything but serious and substantive and documented. And yet a court takes the Biden line and says, we're just not going to talk about it. And that's just wrong, and that's the reason, one of the reasons, people don't trust this outcome.
Yeah. In Florida, we have a lot of people that moved from South America, and so a lot of them have said to me, how is this different than what Maduro's doing? Right? So, and part of it is, you know, people don't have enough information, but it's so simplistic when you hear about people that are dead that are vote, people that don't live in the state to vote, and you hear all these things, and there's no recourse.
By the way, Senator Paul earlier talked about the fact that there has been some lack of understanding between what you testified to and what you stated as to the election being secure from cyber attacks and this notion that there were not instances of irregularity and fraud in this election, which of course there have been in every election in the history of our country, and there were in this election, and we've heard about some of those today. Is Senator Paul correct?
Yes, sir. So, you know, when you come into federal office, you pledge the oath to uphold and defend the Constitution from threats, foreign and domestic, and that's what we did. The focus of the statement, the joint statement, was security. It was secure. I think terms have been conflated here, alleging that we were speaking to the fraud aspect. We absolutely were not. We were talking about security, hacking, manipulation of these machines. That was the thrust of the statement.
I'm from the state of Missouri. Yesterday, I was talking with some of the constituents back at home, a group of about 30 people. Every single one of them told me that they felt they had been disenfranchised, that their votes didn't matter, that the election had been rigged. These are normal, reasonable people. These are not crazy people. These are reasonable people, and who, by the way, have been involved in politics. They've won, they've lost. They've seen it all. These are normal folks living normal lives who firmly believe that they have been disenfranchised, and to listen to the mainstream press and quite a few voices in this building tell them after 4 years of nonstop Russia hoax, it was a hoax. It was based on, the whole Russian nonsense was based on, we now know, lies from a Russian spy. The Steele dossier was based on a Russian spy. After 4 years of that, being told that the last election was fake and that Donald Trump wasn't really elected and that Russia intervened, after 4 years of that, now these same people are told, you just sit down and shut up. If you have any concerns about election integrity, you're a nutcase. You should shut up. Well, I tell you what, 74 million Americans are not going to shut up, and telling them that their views don't matter and that their concerns don't matter and they should just be quiet is not a recipe for success in this country. It's not a recipe for the unity that I hear now the other side is suddenly so interested in after years of trying to delegitimize President Donald Trump. So suffice it to say, I'm not too keen on lectures about how Missourians and others who voted for President Trump and now have some concerns about fraud, about integrity, about compliance with the law, should just be quiet and that they are somehow not patriotic if they raise these questions. I mean, it's absolutely unbelievable. Let me talk about the First Amendment. Judge Starr, I want to begin with you because I know that you have spent much of your life as a litigator defending the First Amendment. Have you ever seen anything like we saw in the closing days of the election when you had the biggest corporations in the history of this country, the most powerful corporations in the world, Facebook, Twitter, working with the Democrat campaign to suppress legitimate reporting on Hunter Biden, who we now know is under federal investigation for criminal wire fraud, tax evasion, other things? Have you ever seen anything in your career like that, Judge Starr, where we have these giant corporate conglomerates censoring and suppressing news directly bearing on an election weeks beforehand and doing it apparently in conjunction with one of the major political parties? Have you ever seen anything like that?
No, I think we live in a new age, and we need to go back to great lessons from constitutional law, as you well know, Senator Hawley, and Justice William Brennan, an icon of the Warren Court, saying that our democracy is based upon robust and uninhibited debate. And Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes saying, let's test things in the marketplace of ideas. You can't test places, ideas and theories unless you allow the marketplace of information communication to flourish.
Well said. I agree with that 100%. And, you know, it's an extraordinary thing not to be able to get. I've had Jack Dorsey, Mark Zuckerberg under oath. We've asked them, did you coordinate with the Democrat campaign? How was it that within minutes of this story breaking, that both of those major corporate giants decided that they would suppress this story and exactly what the Biden campaign wanted them to do? They won't answer questions. I've asked the FEC to determine whether or not this was an illegal campaign contribution on the part of these corporate entities, and I just can't fathom why anybody who cares about free speech in this country would be fine with these mega corporations controlling what people can and cannot say and trying to intervene in a presidential election. Let me ask you, Judge Starr, about something else. Let's talk a little bit about mail-in balloting. In your written testimony, you discussed the findings of the Carter-Baker Commission, and you've mentioned that again here today. That commission commented on the use of mail-in ballots after the 2000 election. Can you tell us a little bit about that commission's finding on mail-in ballots, as you recall it, and talk about some of the warnings that commission put into place?
Their concern and their warning of former President Carter and Secretary of State Baker is that this is a mechanism or a platform for fraud and abuse. Be careful about it. Have safeguards in place. And I think that's at the bottom what some of these concerns are.
The thing that I always like to point back to is that increase of paper ballots across the country and the ability to then conduct post-election audits. In Arizona, I believe it was a 2% audit and 5% audit. In Wisconsin, 2% audit. In Pennsylvania. Most importantly, those, I'm gonna say it again. I'm gonna say it again. The paper ballots. It's those measure the root of trust in the process.
One other that we ran across in Nevada is that we had we had Postal Service employees that we knew of that were directly told to deliver ballots to undeliverable addresses. That is what resulted in ballots being littered all across apartment mailrooms and trash cans everywhere. And they were told in many instances to deliver ballots to undeliverable addresses. And the United States Postal Service, they obstructed our ability to get that evidence in our case. We lost one of our 15 depositions because the United States Postal Service actually obstructed that. It raises the question with all this stonewalling that we encountered. What do you have to hide? And I think we know in this case what there is to hide.
I want to say that right off the bat that I'm honored to represent the president. I was honored to get the call, but I'm not naive. One of the reasons I was called is because virtually every major law firm in this country and in this city refused to represent the president, not because of the lack of merit of his claims. We've certainly demonstrated there's merit, but because of the cancel culture, because of the environment that has been created by the left that has intimidated lawyers. So they can't be here. They're not here because, from the giant law firms precisely because they were ordered by their management committees and others that you cannot take those cases. And the reason you cannot take those cases is because our clients or the Democrat Party or the incoming administration will remember that, and they will hold it against you. That's a sad state of affairs. As a former judge, I was so incensed by that I took the representation. That was the ultimate reason I took that representation. And I've heard a lot today about what went on afterwards, as if these latest threats are coming from the right. Remember why and how this started after the election. We need to have faith in our court system. We have to acknowledge that the court system has been deeply intimidated by the left, just as the lawyers have been intimidated. And that is a sad, sad state of affairs. And I so much appreciate, Senator, that you're holding these hearings, because otherwise, as we're finding out all over the country, these items just disappear. Number two, I wanted to say, as I've said throughout my testimony, that one of the reasons people are doubting the election is because the other side here, the Biden campaign's primary defense is don't hear the evidence. Don't let them litigate. Don't have a court rule on the substance. Let's be honest, that's what's going on. And so that's why the public doesn't trust this outcome. It's not about the president. It's about what the other side is doing to intimidate and force people not to listen, not to take the evidence. I've heard lots of fancy words here today, but if you give transparency, if you let the issues come out, and I've represented Republicans and I've represented Democrats, and at the end of the day, lawyers do their job when it is in the open and we are able to present the evidence.
Thank you, Mr. Troupis. And I noticed Mr. Banal shaking his head when you were talking about the fact that lawyers from large law firms were more than discouraged. They were actually prevented from representing the president, which is kind of a sad state of affairs. It's great having paper ballots, but you have to have access to look at it to give yourself confidence. It has been an honor and privilege to chair this committee. Hearing's adjourned.